I'm a writer, mostly by trade, mostly queer poetry or queer stories. Along with writing poetry, it also means that I'm kind of a masochist, meaning that my poetry comes from the most painful spots of my life. So it should not have been a really big surprise that I found myself driving down a road that I swore I was never going to return to. 20 years prior, it was 19-something, and I had left my uncle's farm for what I was determined was the last time. My fingers in the air, I was leaving the county, I was leaving the state, and I was going to find myself somewhere. And this was the last place I was ever going to return to. 20 years later, I find myself with my girlfriend at the time, driving down this road and turning into the lane, and I'm still not really sure why. It's not like I ever called this place home, because when you're in your teens and you find that you're moving every 8 to 12 months, you really don't call any place home. But here I was, knocking on the door of the person that now owned the house, and explaining the situation to them, that this farm I worked almost every night after school and every day on the weekends. And she nodded and she's like, "You're such and such." It's relative. And I'm not really sure how to take that. Carroll County's kind of at the time was a rather small community in the farming. So I'm not sure how to take that a complete stranger knew who I was. But she gave me the go-ahead to look around. And as I'm looking around, I'm struck with the overwhelming feeling of how everything and absolutely nothing has changed. And I start looking for metaphors, because when you write poetry, everything is a metaphor. Everything has a story behind it. It's a prose. It's something more than just a moment in time. And I start walking back up the lane, my hand trailing along the black fence that I am almost positive was a fence that my uncle and my cousins and I had planted. And I started thinking maybe the metaphor was the fence. Parts of it broken, parts of it still standing, like tin soldiers that have fallen in battle, some still standing, some still not. Maybe the metaphor was the miles that had stacked up, trying to find myself in the time being. But somehow, no matter how far I ran, I still came back to this moment, to this place in time. Maybe as I'm walking along, maybe the metaphor was the pasture that once had cattle in it growing fat and lazy in the summer heat off of timothy and clover, that is now growing 8 feet tall with corn. Maybe the metaphor was me, of how I no longer have a connection to this place. How, no matter how much I never called this place home, there was still a part of it that was still home. And I found myself, after walking for a while, I found myself standing on an access road overlooking the pond where we used to swim in the summer. And I'm standing there in the exact spot where I had my first kiss, trying to find exactly what the metaphor was, and coming up empty. A while longer, just as the sun starts topping the top of the trees, my then girlfriend at the time pulls up behind me in my Suburban. And she rolls down the window and leans out and says, "You know, not everything is a metaphor." And I turn around and I'm like, I don't know. This feels like it. It was in August when I left. Rascal Flatts was playing on the radio, "I'm Moving On," and it's August. 20 years to the month. That has to mean something. And she just replies, "Not everything's a metaphor." Finally, I give in and I climb back into the truck, and as we start up the truck, Rascal Flatts begins playing "I'm Moving On" across the radio. Pulling back onto the two-lane, heading back home that night, laying in bed, staring up at the ceiling in the dark, I hear her whisper in the dark, "I lied. It was always a metaphor."